Netanyahu in Moscow hoping to push Russia to impose crippling sanctions on Iran and prevent delivery of an advanced air defense system to Tehran. Is it in Russia's best interest to yield to Israeli demands? What can Moscow get in return? And could the Kremlin afford souring relations with neighboring Iran? What is at stake for Moscow? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Huda Abdelhamid. Could Russia be changing its policy on Iran? The Israeli Prime Minister has been in Moscow this week, hoping to convince the Kremlin to take a tougher stance on Tehran. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wants the international community to impose, quote, crippling sanctions on Iran for its increasing nuclear development. But Russia hasn't agreed. Israel can claim some success, however. Russia has said it will delay supplying Iran with an advanced air defense system. A deal to provide the Iranian military with the S-300 missiles was signed almost 3 years ago. The missiles would enable Iran to defend itself from incoming attacks. Israel argues that this includes protecting nuclear sites, which it says threaten the stability of the entire region. Russia's also had meetings with both the Palestinian president and the leader of Hamas in recent weeks. Some have read this as Russia seeking to reposition itself as a Middle East negotiator. Well, joining our discussion today in Moscow, defense analyst Alexander Pikayev from the Institute for World Economy and International Relations. In Tel Aviv, Ranan Gessin, an analyst specializing in the Arab-Israeli conflict and former advisor to Ariel Sharon. And in Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz, director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Ranan Gessin, let me start with you. Israel wants to include Russia really in the anti-Iran front, but what is Israel willing to give to Russia?
Well, I think there is a very strong bilateral relations between Israel and Russia today, unlike the relation we had with the former Soviet Union. Russia today is positioning itself to play a key role in the Middle East, and Israel is a key actor. So you have to take into consideration Israel in this respect. In addition to that, you know, we have over 1 million Russian immigrants who immigrated from the former Soviet Union, and that also strengthened, I would say, the bilateral ties. Russia hopes to gain from Israel, I would say, sort of a legitimacy to play a key role in Middle East affairs, in the peace process, but also Russia has an interest, I would say, when the crisis is brewing and when Iran is walking at the brink. Russia wants to portray itself or position itself in a position where it can play a chief mediator while the rest of the world is about to impose sanctions. Russia could come to Tehran and say, listen, we can ease the pressure, but you have to go along with us. That's why I think they're using weapon sales as a political tool, as a leverage. In other words, they agreed to the sale, but they're going to postpone the delivery for two reasons. One, to maintain stability in the region, and two, to enhance their influence in the overall events that are going to shape and take place in the next few months.
Okay, so let me put that question to Alexander Pikayev. What is Moscow trying to get now out of Israel? I mean, it did concede to Israel to delay the delivery of the defense systems, but what is it seeking, really?
Well, I'm not sure that Russia wants to receive something from Israel. Russia wants to engage Israel into the Middle Eastern settlement now when, unfortunately, mission of President Obama and former Senator Mitchell was not very successful. Russia started tries to start new round of diplomatic engagement. Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas visited Russia, leader of Hamas visited Russia. Now Prime Minister Netanyahu pays the first official visit to Moscow, which is very important. And Moscow wants to revive a Middle Eastern diplomatic process towards settlement of conflict there. And Russia wants that all sides play their role and make steps towards each other. So probably this is all Russia wants from Israel at this moment. And may I tell you that indeed Russian-Israeli ties are very strong, and we have a lot of people in Israel of common cultural origin to say, a lot of Russian speakers, 1 million in Israel. It's probably 1/6 of Israeli population. There are flourishing trade and economic ties between two nations, but it is a two-way street. It's not a one-way. It is in which both Israel and Russia are interested in.
Okay, just Alexander Piquet, if you were saying it's a two-way street, but I mean, just shortly before Prime Minister Netanyahu arrived in Moscow, the news agency there came out with information about an Israeli arms deal with Georgia that Russia is not very happy about.
This is absolutely true. We don't want any nation would rearm Georgia, which killed so many Russian citizens a couple of years ago. And of course, there would be retribution for any nation which would restart or continue shipping arms to that newly independent and to an extent failed state. But we also take into account statement made by Israeli authorities just a few months before war in Georgia in August 2008 that Israel unilaterally, voluntarily stopped a major arms shipment to Georgia, and we certainly take that into account.
Peter White, we were just hearing that Russia is seeking a greater role in the Middle East and in the Middle East peace process. But I mean, traditionally, this has been the role of the U.S. Can we think that both the U.S. and Israel would sincerely allow Russia to have a bigger role?
Yes, I believe that the United States has worked fairly well with Russia on the Middle East process. Even during the Soviet period, we often, because the Soviet Union was so closely tied with the Arab countries that were at war with Israel periodically, it was useful to have both countries co-sponsor peace agreements, work with their clients, and so on. The American position is that they support at some point holding a Middle East peace conference in Moscow, which is Russia's desire. So it's not necessarily in conflict. I suspect there's some people in the administration which are happy that Moscow has some means of communicating with Hamas, which the United States does not. There's not necessarily a rivalry. This is one of the areas where there are some overlapping interests. It's a little more conflictual in the case of Iran, but in the case of Israel and Middle East peace, it's mostly coinciding interests.
Okay, but Ranan Gessin, Israel does have a lot of leverage in Washington. Would it expect having that same kind of leverage with Moscow?
Well, I think it's very important in today's world, which is turning more and more into a multipolar world where no one power can decide, that Israel maintain very strong bilateral strategic ties with all regional powers as well as superpowers. And Russia is a superpower. Let's not kid ourselves. Russia is a superpower. It's also a regional power. And it's very important to keep, I would say, open channels and open discussion, frank discussion with Russia. I think Russia and the United States and Israel share one major common interest, and that's to maintain stability in the Middle East in face of the effort of Iran to unstable the Middle East. So I think that's a basic interest.
Israel does support a military strike on Iran sooner rather than later, doesn't it?
Well, Israel keeps that option on the table, same as the United States. You know, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff was here in Israel, and in an interview he said quite frankly that that option is still on the table. It's not the preferred option, not for Washington, not for Jerusalem. I mean, we don't think that that's the preferred option, but it has to remain on the table for deterrence purposes. The Russian, on the other hand, have a different view. They feel that through their weapons deal, through their very close contact with Iran, they can impose their leverage, or they can change and modify the behavior of the leaders in Tehran through those special contacts with us. Some other analysts and experts say to the Russians, like some Israelis say, don't hope too much, don't bank too much on this, because the Iranians may deceive you as they've been trying to deceive the rest of the world.
Well, you were talking about the special contacts between Moscow and Tehran, and Russia is indeed an important ally and trading partner for Iran. But observers have been saying that relations have been deteriorating lately. Last year, Iran stepped up its pressure on Russia to deliver the S-300 air defense missiles, but it's still waiting. Until now, Russia has opposed severe sanctions on Iran. Moscow has supported Iran's stance that the country's nuclear program is purely civilian. Last year, Tehran agreed to send some of its uranium abroad to Russia and France for reprocessing. However, last week, Iran announced that it would begin to enrich uranium at home. This prompted the Kremlin to say that a new round of sanctions could not be excluded. Alexander Pikayev, are we actually seeing a souring of relations between Russia and Tehran at the moment? And is Russia really running out of patience?
Well, indeed, Iranians made certain controversial statements in recent months, both regarding their nuclear program and Russian-Iranian relations. And Russia actually already made clear that deliveries of S-300 air defense interceptors will be delayed. And secondly, Russia would not oppose anymore to restart the process of sanction escalation from the UN Security Council, so that Prime Minister Netanyahu, while visiting Moscow, knocking into an open door, Russia already accepted what the United States, European nations, and Israel wanted from the Russians. Now, the whole question is how to convince the Chinese, which really have a huge economic stake into Iran, which could be harmed by a potential new round of the UN Security Council sanctions. And the second question is how to attract Iranians, how to make them interested in international dialogue, what international community could offer them in order to convince them to refuse from the most controversial elements of their nuclear program. And here what we need a strong stick. I think Russia accepted that, but also we need a strong carrot, and it is what I believe the United States still need to accept.
Okay, Peter Weitz, I mean, how can we attract Iran to have a dialogue with the international community when there are calls for crippling sanctions, paralyzing sanctions by Hillary Clinton, and Iran knows very well that also countries like Israel and the US would, in the end game, hope for a regime change?
Well, the administration made what it considered to be, and most observers tend to agree, and a sort of strong effort to reach out and engage in a dialogue with the Iranian government last year. There was the Nowruz greetings, there were meetings with U.S. officials, there were various initiatives. The problem we've run into is because of domestic developments in Iran, it's become very difficult to be able to secure an agreement. Anytime someone in Iran proposes, for example, reaching a nuclear deal, they're attacked by other elements of being soft on the United States, not defending Iranian interests. And so you've gotten to a dynamic where it doesn't look like a dialogue is going to work. The administration is now thinking about using sanctions ideally to resume the dialogue, but also as a means of slowing down Iran's nuclear developments, discouraging other countries from following Iran's path, reassuring allies such as Israel and the Persian Gulf states. So I think that's the path we're going to see, pushing into sanctions, building up U.S. defenses in the region, and basically, although they won't use the term, trying to contain Iran and especially its nuclear developments, but otherwise its general influence in the region.
Well, Radhan Ghassin, isn't the problem at the bottom line a race for superiority in the Middle East, in the sense that Israel is the nuclear power of the region and it really doesn't want to have any other competition?
Well, you know, that's not the main issue. The main issue is which power or which country destabilizes the region, which country wants to change the environment, make it more hostile, more violent, and which wants to maintain stability. I think the moderate Arab countries and the Gulf Emirates want stability. I think Israel's neighbors want stability, Egypt and Jordan. Israel wants stability. Iran doesn't want stability at this stage. And I think what the Russians are trying to do is to keep an open door, so when the crunch hits and the sanctions, the biting sanctions, the crippling sanctions are imposed, they hope that Iran will come to them to try and change the predicament. While the rest of the world wants to engage in, I would say, regime change, I think the Russian effort at this stage is to influence the current regime. Or if you want, it's the classical case of the good cop, bad cop. When the United States is playing now the bad cop, Russia is trying to portray itself as the good cop. Both have the same mission, and that is to dissuade Iran from continuing with its nuclear program.
Well, still, I mean, the delivery of those S-300 missiles would change the balance of power in the region. Until now, Iran's air force and defense systems are outdated, and some of the fighter planes even trace back to about 30 years ago, which puts Israel at a huge advantage if it were to strike Iran. But with the S-300 defense system, Iran would become more capable of fending off any airborne threat. The S-300 can track 100 targets at a time and can be fired simultaneously at up to 12 targets. If these S-300 missiles are delivered to the Iranians, it would become a major issue for Israel, which fears that Iran could possibly support Syria or Hezbollah with the system, making it more difficult for the Israelis to carry out airstrikes in the region. Israel also argues that Iran will use the missiles to protect its nuclear capabilities. Now, Alexander Pikayev, certainly this is a discussion that the Russian leadership has heard from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when he was in Moscow.
Well, I'm not sure that Iranian issue is a major question of the visit of Prime Minister to Moscow. But regarding the S-300, indeed, there are debates here. And some people tell that, well, we are very serious. We don't want to have a war, another war in the Middle East. We saw so many of them in a recent decade, or in last decade, and still the wars are there, and we don't want to have more because it could make a lot of additional problems. So that if we were serious in that, well, why shouldn't we deliver defensive, purely defensive capabilities to Iran in order to demonstrate that we are serious and we would help Iranians to defend themselves if needed? We don't want any new aggression or interventions in the Middle East. But still the Russian authorities made a decision to delay deliveries of S-300 to Iran. I do not believe that it could happen anytime soon, but still there are debates here, so that probability is above zero. And some people now saying, well, Americans are going to deploy hundreds of missile interceptors in Central and Eastern Europe. It is against Russian interest. Russia is very concerned about that. And in this time, why should we follow American askings? Why should we follow American policy not to deliver just a few S-300 air defense batteries, purely defensive batteries to Iran? Why should we lose these very attractive, potentially multi-billion market for Russian arms sales just to please Obama administration, which now it seems tends to ignore important Russian interests?
Well, Richard White, I mean, at the moment, as Alexander Pikayev said, Russia is holding off the delivery of those missiles. What do you think will trigger Russia to change its position?
Well, at the moment, Russia's been pursuing this policy for several years, and at the moment, Russia's in a very good position. I think they really like the status quo. They have these missile interceptors they can offer. They've claimed, they've said they signed a contract, but they don't deliver them. So the Iranians keep on trying to make concessions to Russia to get the missiles. The Americans and the Israelis go to Moscow and lobby not to sell them so they can play the mediator. As long as Iran is alienated from the West, that leaves Russian and Chinese companies, predominantly now the Europeans are leaving, a dominant position in the Iranian economy. That gives Russia leverage with respect to disputes over the Caspian and other issues. So Russia is probably, of all the countries, most prefers the status quo where we are now. So it would be hard to see what would cause them to actually go ahead with that delivery. That said, the description of the system, I think, may exaggerate its capabilities. It's not the top-of-the-line Russia system. They already have an S-400. There are many variants of the S-300. It's not clear which variant would be involved. I think what would happen is the United States would give Israel and the technology it would need to be able to carry out the strike. But nobody wants Israel to actually to attack Iran. It would be a disaster, at least for U.S. interests, and perhaps for everyone else's interests as well. So I think it's just a matter of reassuring Israel, perhaps through other means, perhaps through air missile defenses, etc.
Well, Ranan Gissin, you were talking earlier that Iran is a destabilizing factor in the region, but isn't also Israel's position as destabilizing in the sense that it keeps on calling for military action also against Iran, which is also destabilizing, and the peace process is going nowhere?
Well, one must read very carefully what Israel is saying. Israel is saying time and again, and all its leaders, both Netanyahu and former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and Sharon himself said it, Israel does not want to use the military option. That's not its first choice. It is a choice in case things come to worse and the sanctions don't work and the whole world doesn't work. But Israel doesn't think that this issue is an Israeli issue. This is a global issue. So Israel is ready to participate in what the international community is doing, but it says in order to keep the leverage, in order to keep the deterrent effect against Iran, that option must remain on the table. Not necessarily to be used. There are plenty of other options, plenty of other sanctions that can be used effectively if imposed before and would I say afterwards make this the use of the military option obsolete, and we don't need to use that. Now, I just wanted to make a comment about the S-300. This is called a defensive weapon, but it's destabilizing because of two factors. And let me just put my analyst hat on one hand. One, if you are right by your assessment that Israel wants to conduct a military strike, then it should preempt before the missiles are deployed. Okay, if you accept that this missile, so this is a destabilizing factor. It's also destabilizing from the point of view of Iran. If anyone wants to dissuade Iran from continuing its nuclear program, once you provide them this protective air defense umbrella, if it has that capability, they may be led to think, okay, we can continue with our program with impunity, with immunity, and no one will dare strike us. So that's why the Russian decision to delay the delivery of the missile is the right decision.
Okay, gentlemen, we have already reached the end of the program. So Alexander Pikayev in Moscow, Ranan Gissin in Tel Aviv, and Richard Weitz in Washington, D.C., thank you so much. And thank you for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.